Hey, I'm Shaye Warner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Luke Ressler about cover crops, bale grazing, and the variety of practices used on his operation to not only extend grazing days, but also improve soil health. Luke and his wife Elli operate a diversified operation in Northeastern North Dakota with Elli's parents. Now, Luke shares how his fall and winter grazing works when the weather cooperates and when it doesn't, because anyone in a northern climate knows exactly how that goes. So this is an informative and honest episode. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And with that, let's visit with Luke. Does tax season make you want to bang your head against the wall? Is billing a bad word in your household? Does meeting with your ag lender make your blood pressure rise? Stress a little less with cattle management software, Performance Beef. It tracks important feed, financial, and health data, all in one system. The result? You can pull inventories, detailed financials, and invoices in minutes. Get ahead for next year's tax season. Visit performancelivestockanalytics.com to learn more, and you can find that link in the show notes. All right, Luke. Well, it's fun to have you on. I think my husband is more excited that you're on than anyone because he's been telling me he's been saying you should have Luke or Elli on the podcast for probably the last 2 years. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So to get started, my favorite question is, why do you bet on or believe in the beef industry?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I guess I've always been a part of it. I grew up on a farm and ranch over by Cooperstown, and my family raised cattle, and so it's been a part of my life forever. And was blessed marrying into a family too that has livestock, and so I've just kind of continued on. It's just been just part of our lives, and yeah, I don't know. I don't really know that was a hard question, Shaye. God, I've been thinking about that for like the past 4 or 5 days, or whenever you sent it to me, and I was like, man, that's a tough question.
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons we all kind of bet on the beef industry and believe in it, and when you grow up in it, like you and I have, that's kind of holds a different weight too.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. I don't know what the farm would be like without cattle. I don't really know what I would do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about some of the neat things that you're doing on your operation in terms of kind of fall and winter grazing, which I always think is neat for those of us in northern climates, right? So I always like that conversation. Before we dive into some of those specific questions, can you kind of describe your operation so listeners kind of get a feel of what you're working with before you dive into your practices?
Sure. So we farm with Elli's parents and Randy and Julie Lem, and we're located south of Hillsboro, North Dakota. So where we are in the state is on the far east side next to Minnesota border. We're north of Fargo, about 40 minutes or so, 40 miles. So we're in the Red River Valley here, which is primarily farm country. It's a lot of black dirt, high clay soils. We flood. In the spring, we have a river that goes through that's a tributary of the Red River. And so we'll flood in the springtime if we got a lot of snow melt. Typically, we get up over 20 inches of rainfall per year. So we're fairly wet, and I guess what our operation kind of looks like is we're diversified. We've got a small cow-calf herd, and then a feedlot. We've got about 600 head feedlot that all background calves, and been doing some custom feeding here the past 4 years. We've been doing custom feeding, and kind of that's ranged from small, early, like weaned calves to finishers. And then bred cows, bred heifers. I've kind of done different things every year. And then crop side, we raise primarily corn, beans, and barley. And then I raise some flax, sunflowers, and I've had some rye and oats in the past. And then I fit in cover crops into the rotation. And so We just finished barley harvest, and I'm going to be planting like a cover crop mix of winter rye, radishes, peas, flax, and buckwheat. And so when that grows up and starts, well, I'm just going to say about when it gets about 8 inches tall, I'll put just a single wire fence around the field, and I don't split the fields at all, just because it gets to be kind of too much when we're combining other crops and stuff. So I'll just put a single wire around and then kick the cows out there and just let them graze and get some cattle impact on those cropland fields. Oh, and then with like corn, I try to interseed our cover crops or like fly on a cover crop and just get something established, because what I'm trying to do with the farming operation is I'm trying to do more no-till practices. And so I'm using cover crops as a way to use up some of our excess moisture that we have in the springtime. So I'm planting cover crops that will overwinter, such as winter rye, hairy vetch, or some other winter crops that I use. And then those will grow in the springtime, and then I'll come back and I'll no-till my corn and soybeans directly into those crops. And so then I'm trying to fit in the cattle into the operation there too, to kind of utilize the growth in the fall into the winter as much as possible. And I don't get across every acre. We farm about 2,000 acres, but I try to, and typically my grazing is kind of round, close fields that I don't have to run too far to go check on cows. Water is kind of a big issue. Getting water, I haul a lot of water to them because I don't have stock ponds or water set up out in the fields. So hauling water works until it gets middle of December and everything starts to freeze. Once I can't haul water anymore, I move the cows closer to the ranch where we have water set up. Then they just kind of walk to the waters. I would love to have more water. It would open up lots of grazing if I had more water set up. And that's kind of a goal for the future, is to get either rural water or drill some wells or something like that just around, just to give us the option.
Yeah, I don't know many people who feel like they have enough water for the grazing they want to do. I know Philip and I talk about that a lot too. So for people listening, we are recording this on August 29th, just so you kind of get a little bit of a time frame of when Luke is talking about, he just finished up barley and was working on putting in some more cover crops. So Luke, I know it's obviously year and weather dependent, but you talked about when that cover crop gets up to more about 8 inches is when you can kind of turn cows out. On a typical year, kind of what's your target date for being able to start to graze that?
It's usually about 30 to 40 days after I plant. I can get them out there sooner. I just don't want to take off too much of that cover crop right away, because you just kind of lose a little bit of growth, and then some root growth, because it's kind of a main goal with the soil health. I want, above biomass is great for the cows, obviously, but I want that root growth going down into the soil, kind of help build aggregates and promote soil health that way. So that's why I kind of wait a little bit, but I guess other timing wise, it's like you said, it depends. It depends on how much moisture we have. We should, going into this year particularly, we've been wet pretty all summer, so we got lots of moisture. We've got good heat, so that cover crop that I'll be getting seeded here today, I'm going to start today seeding. I would assume that will be up and growing, pretty well in the next week. We've got rain forecasted, so it'll be kind of good timing and things like that.
Yeah. And how long have you been implementing the cover crop? Well, I'm more focused on the grazing, but I know you're doing it for soil health in general, but how long have you been implementing that?
I guess we've been doing it since, kind of more often since 2019, when Elli and I got involved. Randy, he had been doing a little bit, but once Elli and I got involved in the operation in 2019, we've kind of really pushed adding more cover crops, doing more experimenting that with them, and trying to get cattle out to graze. He'd graze a lot of just regrowth and then some radishes and things like that in the past. But having all the radishes and turnips and kind of the other cover crops in there, the rye, that's been since 2019. And then growing up in Cooperstown, my family, they had been doing, that's kind of what got me into soil health and got me interested in it. Was my family back home. I remember it was when I was back in high school, like 14 years ago, we were planting radishes and turnips and peas after wheat harvest. And I remember we got a good rain one year. And I remember driving across the field, and the turnips were like soccer balls out there. They were huge. And we were just bouncing across the field. I just thought that was awesome. And then we were able to get the cows out, and they were, well, we didn't bring them home until I think Christmas or whenever. It was whenever it snowed enough and the cows kind of quit. They were looking to come home. So we moved them home then. And doing that, I just thought that was so cool to have them out on the fields. Didn't have to feed them hay. And that really got me interested, kind of looking at, well, how can we extend the grazing season further into the winter? And got me interested in soil health, which then led me after college. I was a crop and weed science major, and then I worked for the NDSU soil health department after college at NDSU and worked there for 2 years and just did more research into grazing and cover crops there. And then I took what I learned from NDSU and then implemented that here on our farm.
All right. So specifically with the cover crops, I know you just went through and you have a background from it with the operation you grew up on, education, etc., and your in-laws were already doing a little bit of it. But when you think back to when you and Elli got onto the operation and were getting more involved and really pushing this more, is there anything you would have done differently from the start now that you're a few years in?
A couple things we've learned is, well, for one, like turnips, purple top turnips. We planted those. This was actually, I learned this from back on my family's operation. We had those big turnips. Well, they kind of went to seed, or some of the seed didn't germinate that fall, and they germinated the next spring. And then we rotated. Typically, we've gone from wheat or barley to a soybean the next year, or a navy bean, edible bean. And I remember those turnips would not die. They like kept germinating throughout the year. And by harvest time, we had big turnips out there, and you're cutting low to the ground. And you want to talk about a mess, combining beans. We were picking up turnips, and they were staying in the navy beans, and it was just a slow process. And so it's one thing, like trying to mix, management wise, you got to think ahead of like, okay, what's my next crop going to be? Am I going to have any issues with this cover crop the next year? If there's any that's gone to seed or anything like that. And so that's like fields that I know I'm going to go to beans or something. I don't put a purple top turnip in there, and I've just stayed away from that for ever since. And maybe it would be fine, I'm sure other people have good success, but I had that one bad experience. And so that's just one thing that I've learned. Different rates, like seeding rates, that kind of changes. I've kind of stuck with like a low rate for my radishes. With my cereals, I plant kind of typically 40 or 50 pounds in an acre with my cereal rye. I get good grazing out of that, some good biomass, and then in the springtime, that's a good amount of seed out there to take up some excess moisture. I have gone higher rates, to really get a lot more biomass out there, which is fine, but it kind of, I don't know, kind of messes things up a little bit in springtime. I've had good and bad things happen. where it's taken too much moisture in the spring away from my cash crop. So that's kind of where I just kind of sit in the middle of the road for our soils. I tell people with more sandier soils, I would go with a lower rate just so you're not taking up excess moisture in the spring. With my heavier soils over here, I do put a little bit higher rates on just because I can handle it and our soils can handle that. But I think there's kind of a threshold there for me too, so I kind of keep it in the middle. Cost-wise too, a lower rate is cheaper. We're always trying to lower input costs and try to keep it as cheap, but kind of get enough bang for the buck out of it.
Want to boost your herd's profitability? Choose Red Angus, the beef industry's most favored female. Registrations are up 24% over the past decade thanks to their docile temperaments, adaptability, and premium carcass quality. The Red Angus Association of America has rebranded its feeder calf program as Angus Access and partnered with Breeder, giving commercial cattlemen cutting-edge digital tools that make it easier than ever to capture premiums. Elevate your operation with Red Angus. And after this podcast, tune into Red Angus Remarks. So, as you're talking, there are two primary benefits from implementing these cover crops that you've kind of touched on, and that's, you're able to graze those cattle for longer days, so a little less feed input, fuel input there. And then also just the soil health aspect of it too, which obviously has a big impact. Are there any other benefits that you've seen that you want to talk about, or would you like to touch on either of those two a little more?
I'll talk on a little bit more of just those two main, those are my two main ones. Just being able to have them out. Like last year, I had a prevent plant field it was too wet in spring, so I planted a 10 species cover crop mix on it. And I grazed cows on that. It started it was in October when we moved them out there. And I grazed them out there I didn't bring them home till January 1st last year. And granted, we had a pretty open winter last winter. And I was supplementing some hay to them, but it was kind of like every other day I'd bring them some hay. They were mostly interested in going out and picking and grazing. And so having them out there till that January 1st or into January is just awesome. For us, the less hay, the less having to start up a tractor in the winter time, things gelling up, trying to get things warmed up and going. I don't want to be out there in a tractor either. It's just a lot easier to run out with a four-wheeler, check on them, and then get back home and go work on some other things. And the soil health-wise, kind of what I've seen, and I've done some different things, is like it seems to take our ground about 2 years to cycle, like our residue nutrients. And so I've seen benefits. I don't really get the benefit that next year, like nutrient-wise, but then 2 years down the road, I kind of see a bump in our soil tests, and then you can kind of see it in the crop the next year, like 2 years down. It just seems like it just takes a little bit for our biology to get going, to cycle through everything. But yeah, typically about 2 years, like where I've fed, hay or something out on fields, next year, my crop, it looks like it's struggling because there's a lot of residue or something like that out there. A lot of manure out in strips or in areas. But then 2 years later, you can just see it in that crop, in that spot. You get a yield bump, crop looks a lot healthier, soil looks good, there's worms. So yeah, just those couple things have really been something that I've noticed. With our farm, like I said before, we flood. And that's kind of too why we have kind of implemented more of the no-till practices and cover crops, is not only get a lot of wind erosion here, we get the water erosion. And like after the fields flood, we'll have whole quarters go underwater because we're so flat. And you go out there and you can see that soil washing effect out there with this ground, with our land prices being so high. I want to try to protect the soil, and so that's where I'm trying to keep more residue out there, adding the cover crops so I have a living root, something growing, keeping the soil in place, and just being able to get the cattle out there is just an added benefit that they get to utilize that growing root and high quality forage later on into the season. And two, our operation, we're kind of different up here, is we switched our cow-calf operation to fall calving. So we're actually calving right now too. And the reason I did that was we calved before in the early spring, so March, April, and I'd be still snowy, still cold, it's wet, and we'd have them up in the lot and calving. It just didn't really like doing that. It was a lot of work. And then we pushed them back to May, and then we flood, and we'd have calves out. It'd flood overnight, and you'd have newborn calves in belly deep water. That just wasn't working. It's muddy, so we'd still have them. The feedlot's up on higher ground, so we'd still have them in the feedlot, even though we're in the spring. You want them out on grass. And so we're like, well, it's 80 degrees, sunny, dry in the fall, and let's try it there. And so we pushed them back to fall, and we've had really good luck with it. The cows are in good shape. They've been grazing all summer, walking around, so we've hardly had any calving issues. Calves are like these ones, they're all 70 to 80 pounds. They get up and suck right away. We do have some flies, but those calves, when it's this dry, they dry off so quick. And we have had some fly issues in the past with navels and things, but we try to get in and squirt the navel with some iodine, and then we tag them. And that's about all we do with those calves. So the cover crops, back to the cover crops and fall grazing. So we breed in November. So November 15th is when I kick out bulls. And so we're kind of shooting for that mid-August calving date. So you're trying to get those cows to be gaining weight, have their calf on their side. I want something high protein, good forage out there for them. So being able to graze covers in the fall has really helped. I've noticed with the cows that, our cow herd that I've got out grazing, getting those cows pregnant that's worked pretty well. We've had, just a handful that come up hoping or whatever. But overall, we're pretty happy with our pregnancy rates. And then I've had where I don't have cattle out grazing on those cover crops. I'm, supplementing some feed and stuff like that. Conception rates haven't been quite where I want them to be. Everything's going to be out on covers this fall in November. Hopefully we don't have a foot of snow. Who knows what Mother Nature will do. Then I'll throw a monkey wrench into everything, but then you just adjust. But ideally, if I got them out there, I usually have the bull. I pull the bull. It's 45 days. And so January 1st, I'll pull the bull. Typically, we're moving cows home. We'll just pull the bull off at that time. And we've been having pretty good luck with that.
I grew up fall and spring calving. Then my parents switched over completely to fall. And I miss it, especially when it's the end of March or into April and there's a blizzard or whatever it may be. So there's pros and cons to it. And the breeding season can be challenging when it's cold like that. But it sounds like you've got things figured out and are working there. But you kind of already transitioned into, hopefully it doesn't snow the beginning of November. And that's kind of what I want to talk about too, because the last 2 winters have been more open, but the winter before that was anything but open. So what is kind of your backup plan if you can't graze as long as you wanted to? Because like you said, in North Dakota, it can snow on Halloween if it wants to, or whenever, and we don't know if it's going to stay or not.
And typically it can snow. The snow is fine. It's if we get ice. Well, that was 2 years ago, or was that even last year? a couple years ago, we had a big ice storm come through, and that cows can dig down, they can dig through pretty good amount of snow and find those covers, but it's when it rains and freezes, they don't like going through ice. And so that's where I start supplementing with some hay. And then I'll have some bales set out. I'll move them home and I'll move them on to bale grazing after that, if they can't be grazing out on the fields. But the ice, that's not only a problem with like them not being able to graze, it's a fence problem. So I use like a poly wire fence around all my fields. It's just a braided rope, and that ice can just hang on that fence, and so we'd have to go around and bust all the ice off of the wire. Otherwise the cows will be out. So typically if you keep feed out in front of them, they're happy, but if they start having to go look for things, that's when they get out. And luckily late into the year, that at that time most everything's off typically, but they can get out and make some problems. I don't want them out in the neighbor's sugar beets for sure. Otherwise, I've got, like when I move them home, I bale graze on over the winter out on pasture. The reason why I do pasture is just because, like I mentioned before, that when I'm bale grazing, I leave a lot of residue behind. And so I try not to do that on my crop fields because I don't want a whole bunch of residue that is inhibiting the growth of my cash crop, which 2 years down the road it would probably be fine, but that initial year afterwards it can kind of be a mess. But like out on my pasture ground, I'm not as worried about it. I try to focus my bale grazing on areas that I need more residue out there to catch some more snow to help that grass recover. Places where I'm trying to improve my pasture ground typically, and that's kind of what my backup plan is just to go from crop grazing, cover crops, to bale grazing.
So with that bale grazing, you're focusing it on those specific areas you need. I'm curious with the cows, was there almost like a learning curve where they had to learn to bale graze and clean up after themselves? And then did that sort some maybe harder doing cows off? What was kind of your experience there with training the cows to bale graze, clean up, and maybe not leave so much?
So I kind of transition them from, like, I'll supplement hay out to them for a while out on the fields where they're grazing the cover crops, so they get used to eating hay. And then when we move them home, we had some cows that like they'll fall behind, and so those are the ones that you end up calling. If they can't keep up, we call those ones. But overall, they've done pretty well. I've had to call a few of them, and I'm not, like I said, it depends on the bale that I'm feeding. If I'm feeding good alfalfa, they'll lick that up. But if I'm feeding some, rougher grass, hay, they'll pick through it and leave some. But I'm not really all that concerned about them cleaning it all up. I want that out on my pasture. I want that residue out there. And that's kind of my main goal with that. So if they're wasting some more, in some people's eyes, in my eyes, I'm feeding my soil there. The next year, like, it's kind of cool. You can look at our Google Maps. You can see our bale grazing on Google Maps, and you can see from 1 year like all the rings, and then later on that they'll come out with the next image. It'll be later on in the fall, and you could just see dark circles where those bales were. And kind of what I've seen here is I've had, like, in the springtime, it's kind of weedy, it's kind of a mess, whatnot. It'll kind of be kind of weedy that first graze through when I come back through that paddock. But then come that fall, there's a lot more grass coming up through there. There's still weeds there, typically like thistles or like lamb's quarter, whatever, broadleaf weed. But I do have fresh new grass coming underneath. And then by that next spring, I've got more grass growth in those areas that's more lush. Then the next year after that, it's a really nice grassy area. And during the summer, I'm limited to how much pasture land we have here in the valley. We've got about 160 acres around the ranch up along the river that I graze. And so I move cows every day to every other day in the summer just to kind of maximize. And so like right now, like I grazed my Bale grazing paddock earlier this spring, and now it's been about 45 to 60 days since I've grazed it, and I've noticed new fresh grass coming underneath where those bales were. Mm-hmm. So next year, it's all this stuff, it's a long process. You got to be patient when you're improving these things. They don't improve overnight. I guess the quickest way would be to go dig everything up and reseed and put a whole new planting out there if you really want to make it quick. But like if you're slowly trying to improve areas over time, it's a long game. Anyways, you gotta be patient. But it's kind of fun coming back to those areas. Like every year is different and it changes, and it's just slow improvements, and it's just kind of cool to see.
I'm sure it is. So, Luke, is there anything else, either related to the cover crop or the bale grazing aspect, that we haven't touched on that you think is important to share?
I guess with my bale grazing, I don't always have like bales already set up and ready for those cows to go and eat. I've done kind of like an adaptive bale grazing where I'll want to focus on a certain area. So I'll go and I'll load up a couple loads of hay and set up bales, let's say for 2-week time. Say I went to ranching for profit school, and I didn't want to have people back home running the farm have to worry about those cows to go out and feed, mix up feed or whatever, mm-hmm. to go feed them. So I wanted to feed those cows for 2 weeks. So I went and I hauled enough hay out there for them for 2 weeks in a certain area where I wanted, had them up in trees. I was like, okay, if we have a blizzard, I want them to be able to have some wind protection, things like that. So I went and I set up bales in an area for 2 weeks. People didn't have to worry about them. I could go to ranching for profit school and not have to worry about people, the cows back home. I knew the cows were fed. And I typically do a mix of alfalfa and then a grass, a blend of, I'll put some alfalfa bales out there for some extra protein, and I'll have some rougher hay, ditch hay, and then some grass alfalfa hay. I kind of blend it all so the cows can pick and choose what they want to fit their needs. They obviously go for the best hay right away, but then they'll go and they'll balance their guts out on the other hay. That's kind of really why I want to do more bale grazing with the cows, because also in the winter I'm focused on up in the feedlot. I'm feeding up there, custom feeding, already running the tractor for them. I don't want to have to worry about my cow herd out in the pasture and having to bring them feed, drive another mile or so to get around the river, and just where our pasture is, where the cows are, it adds more time hauling feed out there with a feed wagon. If I just have bales set up and ready for them in certain spots, it's just a lot less work for me, and I can focus on the animals, making sure they're fed on time up in the feedlot and moving snow, things like that up there. So it's a time and just labor thing is why I do the bale grazing. And the calves have done really well. They learn how to graze. That's one cool thing too about grazing cover crops and then the bale grazing. Those calves are learning how to graze from those cows. Cows are teaching them. And then in the springtime, I'll keep my heifer calves on the cows longer, and those cows will teach those heifers how to graze, out on pastures. And then when I'm moving them with the poly wire, those calves know what a poly wire is. They know me moving them every day, and so they get kind of calmed down there, and then they kind of know what's going on, know the system. And then like weaning and things like that, it's been a lot less stress on the weaning that way as well. And because those calves, they know what's going on, they know how to graze, they know. And like I have supplemented with the feed wagon as well, and so those calves, they know what a feed wagon is too, so they hit the bunk pretty easily in the springtime. So just a couple things. It's not always that perfect, but I've seen improvements over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, Luke, as we wrap up, my final question for you, and it can be related to today's topic or just in general, but if you could go back to your first 5 years of ranching, what would you do differently? And I know that's hard for people who grew up ranching, but you can take that from any angle you want.
So every year, it's hard to say what I would do differently in the past 5 years because I've done something different every year. And so I've learned something different. I'm always changing things up and trying to figure out what works best for our operation, for us. And that changes year to year. It just depends. Like family-wise, having a child, that changes things. Want to have them more involved and be around them more, and then just transitioning the farm too. So we're in the middle of that, and so we're trying to figure out, the future for Elli and I, what we want to be doing from what we've done in the past. And so yeah, I'm always changing things. I'm always trying different things. So it's hard to say what I would do differently.
I think that's a fair answer. Well, Luke, thank you for taking time out of your morning. I know you're busy, but I appreciate the time and conversation today, and I know my listeners will too. For those of you out there listening, I will link Luke and Elli's website in the show notes. And remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating and review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this conversation interesting and or valuable. But with that, happy ranching, folks.